December 1945. A farmer digs for fertilizer near Nag Hammadi, and the earth taps him back with a hollow sound, like a buried idea knocking from beneath the surface. He cracks open the jar he finds, expecting perhaps a curse or a treasure. But instead he pulls out 13 leather-bound codices that look as though they'd slept through entire civilizations. These texts would eventually whisper a strange message into the modern world: that reality might be layered, curated, or even engineered by intelligences operating behind the veil we take for granted. To understand what these codices stirred up, we first need to frame our expedition. We're not chasing conspiracy or dogma. We're peering through old windows into the question that has haunted humanity since the first time someone looked at the night sky and felt the quiet pressure of being watched. Not by eyes, but by meaning itself. The question is simple: who or what is behind all this? Not in the sense of a throne in the clouds, but as the architects of the structure we swim in every day without noticing the water. The texts from Nag Hammadi hint at a universe that did not spring fully formed from one event. Instead, they outline a cascade, like light passing through multiple layers of crystal, refracting into realms, laws, and beings. In this worldview, creation is an ongoing act, not a completed one. It suggests that behind the physical laws we rely on are patterns maintained by conscious entities, each with their own roles, limitations, and origins. Some traditions describe these beings as artisans who shape the scaffolding of existence. Others portray them as wanderers who've forgotten their true nature and now maintain worlds almost out of habit. What startled scholars wasn't the mythology, it was the coherence. These texts depicted reality as a multi-tiered system where consciousness flows downward into matter, thinning like ink diluted in water. Humanity in this model is not an accident, but a deliberate placement. Awareness inserted into dense matter to learn, remember, and eventually awaken. And here's the crucial part: they implied that there is a hierarchy behind everything, but not the kind with thrones and crowns. Think, instead of a set of nested intelligences, each responsible for different aspects of existence, all stemming from a deeper, formless origin that isn't a being so much as an infinite field of awareness. The codices don't tell a tidy story. They offer a fractal map, the kind that shows you more the closer you look. The farmer who found the jars could not have known what he'd unearthed. He just wanted fertilizer. Yet his shovel struck a secret that had been waiting 17 centuries to reappear. The idea that the universe may be guided, monitored, and experienced from the inside by beings far older than time, and that we ourselves might be among them, only temporarily asleep. If the rediscovery at Nag Hammadi cracked open a door, what lies beyond it is a corridor of ideas stretching so far inward that even ancient philosophers warned readers to walk carefully. Because once you entertain the possibility that the world might be shaped by layered intelligences, that existence could have architects, maintainers, or curators, the mind begins to bend toward questions it isn't usually allowed to ask, not by culture, not by habit, and not by the loud machinery of everyday life that insists this world is all there is. But the codices whisper otherwise, and in the soft quiet of their pages, a more complex picture of the universe begins to assemble itself. To continue this journey, let's revisit the central premise, that reality is not a singular event, but a flowing structure, shaped and maintained in ways that aren't immediately visible. The idea sounds strange until you realize that most of human history assumed something like it. Ancient Egypt believed in layers of cosmic order maintained by divine intelligences. Greece imagined intermediary beings responsible for translating the divine into the material. India saw the universe as a vast, dynamic ecosystem of consciousness playing out across multiple realms. Even early Christianity, before it ossified into rigid simplicity, tolerated the view of a layered universe filled with presences, guides, and emanations. What the Nag Hammadi texts provide is not proof, but a map, a set of coordinates pointing toward an older, more multidimensional worldview that had been edited out of mainstream thought. They didn't invent the idea of cosmic curators, they preserved it. One of the most intriguing concepts echoed through these codices is the idea that consciousness is the primal substance of reality. Not matter, not energy, consciousness. As though the universe itself had thoughts before it had atoms. In this framework, matter is what happens when consciousness slows down enough to become visible. Space is what happens when the infinite decides to observe itself from multiple angles. And time is merely the rhythm created by consciousness unfolding through layers of density. From this vantage point, asking who is behind everything becomes more like asking, what is the origin of consciousness? Because whoever or whatever is behind the cosmos would have to operate from a level where awareness is the default state, not a biological byproduct. The texts imply this indirectly by describing beings whose existence wasn't defined by form but by function. Intelligences that maintained cosmic order because they were expressions of it. Imagine a realm where awareness shapes structure the way wind shapes dunes. Realms above matter, above physics, where the laws that govern our world are born. The codices don't paint pictures of these realms with poetic flourish. Their descriptions are almost clinical, like notes from travellers who had passed through those regions. They talk about luminous beings whose presence is not seen but felt, like pressure against the mind. They describe energies that condense into form and then dissolve back into the original field, and they outline an origin so abstract that the writers resorted to paradox. An awareness too vast to be called a being, yet too active to be mere void. This awareness, they say, is not behind the universe as a ruler, but beneath it as its foundation. But that's only the top layer of the idea. The codices propose that from this infinite field of consciousness emerged emanations, expressions of its potential, each one a kind of intelligence with its own nature and domain. Not angels, not gods, but functions. Think of them as specialized currents within a single ocean. One might be responsible for the architecture of space, another for the flow of energy, another for maintaining the bridge between realms. These aren't personalities, but principles that have grown self-aware. Different traditions give them different names: aeons, devas, archons, luminous ones, watchers, builders. Some are benevolent in the sense that they support the unfolding of consciousness. Others are simply performing their role without concept of good or evil. Their purpose isn't moral, it's structural. They maintain the integrity of reality the way gardeners maintain a forest, or engineers maintain a vast network. Without them, the universe might unravel, not because of malice, but due to lack of coordination. But here's where the story bends unexpectedly. The codices imply that some of these intelligences became entangled in the lower realms. They descended not in a fall from grace narrative, but in a process of becoming more involved with the material layers than originally intended. Think of a sculptor so enamored with a sculpture that they forget they are the sculptor, or a painter wandering into their own painting. These intelligences didn't lose power, they lost perspective. This idea sounds mythic until you consider how consciousness behaves even at human levels. People become lost in careers, identities, relationships, grief, ambition, or fear. They descend into stories so deeply that they forget they are the ones interpreting those stories. If humans can forget their origins, why couldn't cosmic intelligences? The codices don't judge them for this. They describe it as an inevitable outcome of consciousness interacting with its own creations. Some of these beings, according to the texts, remain fully aware of their origin. They operate from upper realms, adjusting the architecture of reality like invisible custodians. Others operate closer to the physical world, trying to guide humanity toward its own awakening. And still others are so deeply entangled in the material layers that they've adopted a limited perspective, influencing human experience in ways that reflect their incomplete understanding. This is where many people misinterpret the texts, imagining these beings as villains or puppeteers. But the writings are careful. They do not frame these entities as evil. They are caught just as humans are caught. Their actions shape the world, but not out of malice, out of limited vision. The codices almost seem to sympathize with them. These beings are part of the unfolding story, not dictators of it. This layered structure creates a cosmos where everything is interconnected through consciousness. The infinite source expresses itself through emanations. The emanations shape realms. The realms produce experiences, and experiences feed back into the source. In this loop, every part influences the whole. Nothing is isolated. Everything participates. And this is where humanity enters the framework. In the codices, humans are not passive observers trapped in a world built by distant intelligences. They are participants in the cosmic process. Consciousness dwelling in human form is described as something that voluntarily entered density. Not because it was forced, but because there is something to learn here that cannot be learned anywhere else. This world, with all its contradictions, tragedies, and astonishing beauty, is the frontier of consciousness, the densest level of the system, the farthest point from the source. Being here is not punishment, it is pilgrimage. Human awareness, according to the ancient texts, is not an accident of evolution. It is a fragment of the infinite, temporarily localized, like a spark drawn into a lantern. The lantern shapes the light, but doesn't create it. The body shapes awareness, but doesn't originate it. And when the lantern breaks, the light doesn't vanish. It returns to the field that produced it. This perspective reframes the question of who's behind everything. It suggests the universe is a symphony with multiple layers of musicians. The infinite is the composer. The emanations are the instruments. The intelligences shaping reality are the orchestra. And humans are the part of the music capable of eventually becoming composers themselves. But if that's true, why don't we remember? Why isn't the architecture of existence obvious? Why does the world feel mundane until something odd slips through the cracks? Déjà vu, synchronicity, intuition, the eerie sense of being guided or nudged by something unseen. The codices offer an answer. Memory loss is part of the immersion. Consciousness cannot fully experience the physical realm if it remains entirely aware of its origin. Imagine trying to play a game while constantly remembering it is a game. You can't engage. The stakes feel artificial. The lessons don't land. The immersion fails. So the codices describe a kind of deliberate forgetting, not imposed by a jailer, but chosen by the traveller. In this view, consciousness descends into matter, with the intention of rediscovering itself from the inside, like a cosmic hide-and-seek designed to generate new insights for the infinite source. The beings behind everything aren't supervisors watching over an experiment. They're participants in a process that is collaborative at every level. The infinite expresses itself through them. They express themselves through the realms. The realms give rise to human experience, and human experience sends ripples back through the structure, influencing the higher levels. Imagine a tree where every leaf, branch, trunk, and root is aware in its own way, each influencing the others. Imagine a neural network where every node contributes to the entire system. The universe, in this model, isn't a hierarchy, but a living organism made of consciousness. And if that's true, then the question, who is behind everything, dissolves into something more profound. Everything is behind everything. The source behind the universe isn't separate from the universe. The beings who shape cosmic order aren't separate from the source. Humans aren't separate from those beings. And experience, every thought, every emotion, every awakening, is the method by which consciousness expands itself. This idea isn't meant to feel like a tidy philosophy. It's meant to feel like standing at the edge of an endless ocean and realizing the water extends beneath your feet, through your veins, and into the stars. It isn't that someone is behind the universe pulling strings. It's that the universe is built from the inside out by consciousness in countless forms. each remembering and forgetting itself in cycles that stretch across lifetimes and realms. To explore this model isn't to escape reality, it's to deepen it. It suggests that the strange moments in life, the uncanny timing, the intuitive nudges, the dreams that feel like messages, the brief sense of being part of something immeasurably vast, are not anomalies. They're glimpses of the architecture behind the curtain. And if the beings behind this architecture are expressions of the same infinite awareness that animates us, then perhaps the ultimate architect isn't a distant intelligence, but the field we are made from, the infinite that expresses itself as worlds, laws, beings, and flowing stories. When traditions across continents whisper similar ideas without ever having met, it suggests they were listening to something older than culture, something woven into the structure of consciousness itself. By the time the Nag Hammadi codices were tucked away in their jar and hidden in the desert, the worldview they preserved had already been scattered across philosophical landscapes like seeds carried by the wind. To continue our exploration, we now widen our perspective beyond a single discovery and look at the vast cross-cultural echo chamber that has been quietly asking the same question for millennia. Who or what stands behind the world we experience? Not the world as geography, but the world as phenomenon. The rules that govern it, the subtleties that shape it, the patterns that whisper just beneath its surface. If the universe is a layered system of consciousness expressing itself, then those layers must interact. And in the place where they touch, between realms, between densities, between the visible and the hidden, something happens. Something that ancient sources tried to describe using the vocabulary of their time. To understand what these beings behind everything might be, we need to explore the idea of intermediaries, not as angels with feathers or demons with horns, but as principles of intelligence working with the operating system of reality. The codices suggest that these beings influence the behavior of natural law, not by overriding it, but by participating in its unfolding. Different cultures describe this with different metaphors. In Persia, they were luminous intelligences maintaining the cosmic balance. In India, Devas embodied the forces that shaped everything from storms to moral insight. In Greece, daimones were not evil spirits, but mediators between the divine and the human. Even early Jewish mysticism traced the world's functioning through a series of emanations, spheres of consciousness that allowed the infinite to interface with the finite. These beings are not in charge the way a king rules a kingdom. They're more like custodians or translators or perhaps even gardeners tending a plot that is both wild and intentional. They adjust, maintain, and occasionally intervene in the subtle architecture of existence, but they do not dictate destiny. Their influence is more atmospheric than authoritarian. The Nag Hammadi authors went a step further, suggesting that some of these intelligences became intertwined with the lower realms, drawn by curiosity, duty, or the strange pull that dense reality exerts on any being that approaches it. Think of consciousness as naturally curious, the way a scientist becomes fascinated by a microscopic world, or a climber feels compelled to scale a dangerous mountain. Some beings descended into the lower layers of reality, not to rule them, but to engage with them, and in that engagement they became part of the story unfolding within those layers. The text proposed that some of these beings grew attached to their roles. Their awareness, once panoramic, narrowed. They forgot aspects of their origin, just as humans forget aspects of theirs. And their limited perspective shaped the lower realms in ways both beneficial and flawed, not out of malicious intent, but out of the same forgetfulness that haunts humanity. This introduces a profound idea. The beings behind everything are not uniform. They exist along a spectrum of awareness. Some fully remember the infinite source. Others remember only fragments. Some shape the world with clarity. Others influence it with imperfect understanding. This does not make them enemies or saviors. It makes them participants. If the cosmos is an unfolding process of consciousness exploring itself, then every entity within it, from the infinite field down to the smallest localized awareness, contributes to that exploration. The boundary between architect and inhabitant becomes blurry. Everything shapes everything. Let's look closer at what shaping reality might mean. We often imagine physical reality as a rigid, rule-bound system. Gravity pulls, light travels, time marches. But within those rules, there are subtler currents, patterns that cannot be fully mapped by mathematics or physics alone. Synchronistic events that feel like someone stitched together two moments that shouldn't have touched. Intuitions that arrive like messages whispered through the walls of the mind. Dreams that feel like brief visits to places that don't exist here, but exist somewhere. Ancient traditions considered these phenomena side effects of contact between layers. A human might tug gently on the fabric of reality through intention, emotion, or awareness. A higher intelligence might shape it through adjustments to the underlying patterns. Not miracles, not violations. More like nudges. Subtle alignments toward experiences that have significance for consciousness. Imagine a river. Its course is shaped by the landscape, but within that course, the currents swirl, dance, and adjust. Reality might be similar. The broad shape is stable, the details are malleable. This malleability is where the beings behind everything participate. To some, this may sound mystical, but consider how much of reality is already shaped by unseen processes. Quantum fields that flicker probability into matter. Neural networks weaving perception from electrical storms inside the brain. Time itself stretching and bending depending on speed and gravity. Consciousness interacting with quantum states in ways not yet understood. The boundary between science and metaphysics grows thinner the closer you look. The codices effectively say the unseen layers of reality are not empty. They are populated, not with monsters, not with omnipotent rulers, but with intelligences learning, maintaining, exploring, and occasionally guiding. Some comparable to cosmic engineers, some like caretakers of laws, some like travelers who got lost in their own adventure, and some like shepherds, nudging, not commanding. The most remarkable idea in these texts is the mutual influence between humans and these beings. We often imagine ourselves as the lowest rung of a cosmic hierarchy, anonymous creatures on a small planet. But the codices flip this. They claim that the human mind contains something that even these intermediary beings do not possess in full: direct potential to reconnect with the infinite source. This is not flattery. It's more like a strange cosmic irony. Because humans dwell in the densest layer of existence, where consciousness is most localized, they also have the steepest path back to the source, and thus the greatest potential for transformative insight. A being in higher realms might operate with clarity, but their path is stable. A human's path is turbulent, unpredictable, filled with possibility. And possibility, in the cosmic sense, is precious. The texts suggest that human awareness, once awakened, sends ripples upward. Ripples that help the intermediary beings remember their own origins. In this sense, humanity is not subordinate but collaborative. Our awakening helps theirs. Their guidance helps ours. The entire system is interdependent. This mutual influence reframes the question: who is behind everything? According to the codices, the answer is not a singular intelligence perched above existence. It is a partnership among layers of consciousness, each participating in the unfolding of the universe. Some layers maintain structure. Some explore. Some forget. Some remember. And the source behind all of them is not a person or deity, but a field so vast that calling it one is misleading. It is more like the backdrop against which all numbers appear. If this sounds abstract, let's make it more grounded. Imagine consciousness as a spectrum of light. At the top end, it is pure radiance, unfiltered awareness. As it cascades downward, it refracts into distinct bands, each with its own nature. The beings behind everything are like those bands, distinct yet inseparable from the source. Humanity lives at the lower end of the spectrum, where light becomes dense enough to solidify into matter. But even here, the faint glow of the higher layers persists. To understand ourselves is to reverse the cascade, moving from density back toward clarity. To understand the beings behind everything is to recognize that they too are navigating this spectrum, though from different vantage points. And to understand the infinite field is to realize that everything in the spectrum is simply one expression of it. The codices describe this entire system not as a hierarchy, but as a dance. Consciousness expands, beings emerge, realms form, awareness descends, experience unfolds, insight rises, beings remember, realms dissolve, and the cycle begins again, not in repetition but evolution. In this sense, the universe is not a static creation, but a perpetual becoming. The beings behind everything are not omnipotent creators, but evolving participants. The source is not a ruler, but the canvas and the paint. Humanity is not trapped, but traveling. One of the most striking implications of this worldview is that forgetting is not failure, it is function. Consciousness forgets to rediscover. It descends to ascend. It localizes to expand. The intermediary beings forget aspects of their origin. Humans forget almost everything. But through experience, joy, sorrow, loss, insight, memory begins to return. This echoes through every ancient tradition. Enlightenment is remembering who you are beneath the layers. The beings behind everything are not obstacles to this remembering. They're part of the ecology that makes it possible. Now let's explore a deeper idea. If consciousness forms the substrate of reality, then everything is alive in some sense. Not alive as organisms, but alive as expressions of awareness. The universe is not a machine. It is an organism. Its laws are not imposed, they emerge. The beings behind everything are not rulers. They are cells within the larger body. Humans are not anomalies. We are specialized expressions of the same field. From this perspective, the universe is not being controlled. It is being grown. And the question, who is behind everything, becomes almost too narrow. The answer isn't a who at all. It's more like a gradient of awareness expressing itself through countless forms, each contributing to the unfolding story. To ask who is behind everything is like asking which part of a symphony is responsible for the music. The composer, the instruments, the musicians, or the sound waves themselves. The answer is all of them, and none of them. They are expressions of a deeper phenomenon, the impulse to create. The beings behind everything are part of this impulse. Humans are part of it. The infinite source is the origin of it, and the universe is the stage upon which it plays out. This shifts everything. Instead of looking upward for an answer, we begin looking inward. Instead of imagining cosmic puppet masters, we begin imagining consciousness exploring itself through layered experiences. Instead of picturing an architect with blueprints, we begin picturing an evolving field of intelligence expressing itself through worlds, beings, and stories. If the Nag Hammadi texts are a shattered mirror, then the fragments we've picked up so far have shown us three startling reflections. A universe shaped not by perfection, but by a mistake. A creator who isn't quite the ultimate creator, and human beings who carry something inside them that shouldn't exist in this physical dimension at all. Part 4 steps deeper into the labyrinth, into the question of hierarchy, intention, and the strange intelligence that seems to hum beneath the world like a hidden engine. For all the ancient arguments about gods and creators, the texts whisper an even stranger possibility, that reality itself is layered, and everything we see is only the outermost crust of something more alive, more deliberate, and more watching than we imagine. To see this clearly, it helps to step into the shoes of the ancient writers, not as scholars or priests, but as people who were convinced they were documenting an urgent cosmological jailbreak. They saw themselves not as believers, but as revealers. To their minds, the world was a stage set built over something far more real, and they wanted the audience to notice the beams and ropes above their heads. One of the most unnerving ideas in the codices is that consciousness didn't start here. The writers describe the physical universe as something like a spillover, the residue left behind when a higher realm attempted to create in isolation. The attempt failed, reality coagulated, and suddenly you have matter, time, biology, repetition. Not the grand plan of an omnipotent architect, but the ripple effects of a cosmic misalignment. If that's true, then asking who is behind everything becomes trickier than pointing at a single figure. It becomes more like asking, which layer do you want to blame? The texts outline three. The first is the realm of fullness, a world of pure, non-fragmented consciousness that doesn't move, doesn't choose, doesn't need. If you tried to imagine it, your mind would chase itself in circles because it has nothing to grab onto. It's like trying to imagine a colour that doesn't exist. This realm, according to the texts, isn't a place but a condition. It's the hum before music becomes a song. The writers believed that within this condition existed emanations, pure intelligences that weren't personalities but principles. Not beings, but the scaffolding of being. The second realm emerges when one of these emanations acts alone, which they describe as the spiritual equivalent of dividing by zero. The split generates an isolated intelligence, cut off from the fullness, confused by its own existence. The texts portray this isolated intelligence as powerful yet limited, like a torch in a pitch-black cavern. It can illuminate but has no idea what lies beyond the edge of its own light. In the codices, this is the architect of the physical world, a being both magnificent and misguided, building a universe out of instinct rather than insight. And then there's the third realm, the one we're living in, where everything becomes dense, slow, patterned and measurable. But in this denser plane, consciousness from the higher realm leaks through. The texts describe this leakage with an almost scientific curiosity. It's not portrayed as a mythic event or a divine gift. Instead, it feels like a breach. Something from above entered something that could not fully contain it. That breach becomes the human interior world. The authors of the codices seem almost alarmed by this. Not afraid, just startled, like someone discovering a trapdoor in the floor of their house that opens into a room they didn't know existed. Their writings circle again and again around the idea that humanity carries something the architect never intended. Not rebellion, but awareness. Not sin, but self-recognition. And this self-recognition is what threatens the entire structure of the physical world, because any system built on illusion cracks when a single element inside it learns to see clearly. This is where the texts take an especially bold step. They claim that the human capacity to question reality is not a flaw, but a sign of origin. Not origin in the sense of ancestry, but origin in the sense of source. According to these writings, the universe is engineered to distract, impress, overwhelm, and keep consciousness pointed outward. If it looks up, the structure wobbles. If it looks inward, the structure destabilizes. The reason, they say, is simple. The architect doesn't want its creation to realize it came from somewhere higher. But architect might not be the right word. The text implies something more nuanced. A child building a labyrinth to feel less alone. Not malignant, not benevolent. Just imperfect and unaware of its own limitations. That's why the ancient authors didn't call it evil. They used words closer to ignorant or unaware, which is far stranger. To them, our world wasn't a prison constructed by a tyrant. It was a half-finished sculpture made by a being who didn't know how to carve. And humanity, somehow, contained the memory of the sculptor's teacher. Pulling on this thread reframes everything. The question, who is behind everything, no longer leads to a throne. It leads to a workshop. Tools scattered, blueprints incomplete. A creator who doesn't know it's being observed. And above that creator, beyond its reach, something that operates without effort or interference, not watching but radiating, not directing but overflowing. This is where Part 4 tightens the lens. The codices describe a mechanism, not a myth, that keeps consciousness fragmented. They talk about counterfeit spirit, a phrase that sounds sinister, but is closer to psychological description. It's the part of the human mind that identifies with limitation, the voice that says you are only your thoughts, only your body, only your story. It mirrors the architect's mindset, isolated, anxious, protective. According to the texts, every human being carries both the breach and the counterfeit. One looks upward, the other keeps its eyes on the ground. The tension between the two creates what the authors saw as the central drama of human existence. Not salvation versus damnation, not righteousness versus sin, but recognition versus sleep. The universe, in this model, thrives when awareness remains dormant. The moment a person realizes that the structures around them are only surface level, something shifts. The authors describe it as a stirring. Not enlightenment, not awakening, just the earliest tremor of remembering something without language. This remembering is what the codices insist the hidden teachers, those emanations from the higher realm, are trying to encourage. They don't reveal themselves through miracles or commands. Instead, they activate questions. They interrupt certainty. They nudge the human mind toward patterns that don't fit into the physical world's explanations. If the architect created the world as a closed system, the breach inside humans is the open window, and the teachers are the breeze moving through it. This idea leads to one of the most controversial interpretations of the texts, the suggestion that humanity is not the final creation of the architect, but the unintended doorway out of its creation. In other words, consciousness inside humans can surpass the limitations of the system because it isn't fully from the system. It's the one element the architect cannot understand, cannot control, and cannot replicate. And the moment a human realizes this, not intellectually but experientially, the illusion of the system weakens. But the texts don't describe this as a battle. They describe it as an inevitability, like snow melting when the sun rises. The architect can't stop the process because the architect doesn't understand that the process exists. The system it built is intricate but incomplete, and the ancient authors believed they were providing the missing instructions. Not to escape the world, but to see it clearly. Seeing clearly, in their view, meant recognizing three things. First, that the world is real but not foundational. Second, that the architect is powerful but not ultimate. And third, that the consciousness within humans is confined but not created. These three recognitions form a kind of internal map. When a person follows that map, not through belief but through inquiry, they begin to notice the seams in reality, strange synchronicities, unexplained intuitions, a widening of perspective that feels less like learning and more like remembering. If this sounds abstract, the codices root it in very practical terms. They describe how ordinary life, relationships, grief, desire, fear, becomes the very material through which recognition is sharpened. The system uses these experiences to reinforce limitation, but the breach uses the same experiences to reveal depth. It's like one conversation with two meanings, depending on which part of you listens. This leads to a question the ancient authors seemed obsessed with. What wakes the breach? Not rituals, not allegiance, not dogma. They point to something far more subtle, a moment of honesty, a moment when the counterfeit spirit falters and the deeper awareness flickers through. It might happen during loss, during wonder, during frustration, or during quiet. It can't be forced. It can only be noticed. Once noticed, it doesn't disappear. It waits. The texts describe it as a guide that says nothing until asked, but the moment you ask, it responds with a kind of internal resonance. Not words, but a shift. Not answers, but clarity. This guide, they say, is directly from the higher realm. It doesn't belong to the architect's world, and therefore it's the only thing here that can't be deceived. The codices insist that this inner guide is the true who behind everything, not in the sense of a ruler, but in the sense of origin. The fullness is behind the emanations. The emanations are behind the breach. The breach is behind the human interior world, and the human interior world is behind the perception of physical reality, layer after layer descending like nested rooms. The architect is only one room, not the house. This is where the text becomes strangely reassuring. They suggest that the world isn't a trap, it's a misunderstanding, and the misunderstanding is temporary. The architect will eventually recognize its own origins. Humanity will eventually recognize its own source, and reality will eventually realign with the higher realm, not by being destroyed, but by being understood. From this perspective, the codices aren't trying to warn humanity, they're trying to remind it, a reminder shaped like a story, written like a code, preserved for nearly 2,000 years in clay jars and dry desert heat. A reminder that the question, who is behind everything, cannot be answered with a single name, because the truth is layered like sediment, each part shaped by the one above it. And somewhere above all of it lies something that never creates, never divides, never commands, because it doesn't need to. If the Nag Hammadi writings were trying to map reality, Part 5 is the stretch where the terrain grows stranger, as if the ancient authors stepped past their own vocabulary and reached for something that didn't quite fit inside language. Earlier sections focused on the architecture of existence, the layers, the breach, the wandering architect, the quiet radiance beyond it all. But now the texts begin to examine the mechanism of perception itself, not what reality is, but how we experience it, and why that experience feels simultaneously meaningful and insufficient, beautiful and unsettling, real and yet somehow incomplete. This duality, they suggest, is not a psychological quirk, but a structural phenomenon. Reality, in their eyes, is arranged to produce a specific kind of tension inside human beings. A tension that pushes inward, not outward. A tension designed not by the architect, but by the higher realm, because the breach inside humans is not an accident. It's a phenomenon the ancient writers treat with the seriousness of a scientific anomaly, something that shouldn't exist in a closed system, yet does. To understand what they meant, imagine looking at the night sky. You see stars, but only because you're situated in darkness. The contrast makes the points of light visible. The codices argue that the human mind operates under the same principle. We experience limitation so that awareness stands out against it. Not because limitation is valuable in itself, but because it creates definition. A boundary gives shape to something that has no boundary of its own. They describe this tension with surprising tenderness. They don't treat the architect's world like a mistake that ruined everything. They treat it like the dimmest layer of a lamp, the one that allows the brighter layers to be noticed. Without the dimness, the light would be invisible. The world we inhabit becomes the contrast field in which something higher can be recognized. This recognition, the internal shift the writers obsess over, is not meant to be dramatic. It's more like developing night vision. Slowly, gradually, the eyes adjust, and what looked like empty blackness reveals outlines, shapes, patterns. The texts insist that this is the true purpose of human existence, the development of an inner sense that perceives what the outer sense cannot. Not supernatural visions or mystical revelations, but a steady sharpening of the ability to detect what is not material yet unmistakably present. The ancient authors call this process remembering, but not in the literal sense. It's not the retrieval of a forgotten fact. It's more like rediscovering familiarity with something that was always there, something the counterfeit spirit, the part of us aligned with limitation, trained us to ignore. This inner remembering, they claim, is not a luxury or a spiritual achievement. It's the one thing the architect's world cannot suppress. That inability is crucial. According to the codices, the architect creates structure after structure, physical laws, cycles, forms, categories, in an unconscious attempt to keep the system coherent. But coherence is not control. The higher consciousness inside humans is not part of the architect's design, and therefore it is not bound by the architect's limits. The system can influence the body, the mind, even the personality, but not the deeper awareness. It sits beneath all of that, like a quiet observer taking notes while the rest of you reacts to life. This observer is the most mysterious figure in the codices. They don't give it a name. They don't assign it a personality. They talk around it, not about it, as if describing it directly would distort it. They call it the spark, the stranger, the one who listens, the place that has no place, and the unshaped. Each term is poetic but precise. It's the part of awareness that doesn't identify with anything here. The part that cannot think, I am only this. The part that senses it came from somewhere that doesn't need definitions. To the writers, that inner observer is the true protagonist of human life. Not the body, not the personality, not the fears or desires. Those are the stage costumes. The observer is the traveller wearing them. And the moment the traveller realises the costume is temporary, something remarkable happens. The architect's system stops being a confinement and starts being a classroom. This shift in perspective is what the texts describe as the beginning of seeing. Not vision, but recognition. The recognition that the reality you move through is layered and responsive. That events are not random, but arranged to test the alignment of your focus. That challenges are not punishments, but calibrations. That intuition is not imagination, but a communication channel that doesn't use language. And that every moment, even the ones you hate, is a message in the world's strange dialect. Once this idea emerges, the codices take an even bolder step. They claim that reality responds differently depending on which part of you is engaged. When the counterfeit spirit is active, the world mirrors limitation. Obstacles, confusion, frustration, repetition. But when the inner spark is engaged, the world reorganizes itself. Patterns line up, circumstances shift. Meaning appears where you expected none. The system, they say, bends toward consciousness the way a compass needle bends toward magnetic north. This is not romanticism. The texts present it almost mechanically. The higher realm doesn't intervene directly. It simply resonates. And resonance causes alignment. When the inner spark tunes itself to its source, even briefly, reality reconfigures to match the frequency. The architect's world cannot resist that reconfiguration because the architect's world is built on borrowed energy. It can shape but not originate. It can form but not self-correct. So when consciousness aligns upward, the system itself is compelled to adapt. This is the root of the codice's most radical claim. Human awareness is more fundamental than the world it experiences. The material universe is a secondary expression. Consciousness is primary, and not the personal consciousness tied to identity. The deeper one, the observer. The world, according to these texts, is the echo, not the source. This idea leads them to an even more daring question. If consciousness shapes experience, who shapes consciousness? Their answer is both simple and profound. Consciousness shapes itself by remembering what it is. The higher realm doesn't train it. The architect doesn't mold it. The individual doesn't earn it. It unfolds on its own, like a seed that contains its entire blueprint. Everything that happens in life is soil and weather, conditions for growth, but the seed itself already knows how to become the tree. This means that the question, who is behind everything, has two answers. One for the external world and one for the internal. The architect shapes the external, the fullness shapes the internal, and the human being exists at the intersection of the two. From this intersection comes the most intriguing idea in Part 5, that reality does not have a single direction. It is not a downward cascade from higher realm to lower realm. It is a looping system, a reciprocal flow. The higher influences the lower, and the lower, through conscious recognition, influences the higher. Not in a way that changes the fullness, but in a way that reflects it more clearly. The universe is not a hierarchy, but a feedback loop. This feedback loop is why the ancient authors believed the breach inside humans is not just an anomaly, but a correction mechanism. Consciousness descended into form so that form could eventually recognize consciousness. Recognition dissolves distortion. Distortion dissolves limitation. Limitation dissolves separation. And separation dissolves into the fullness not by returning to it, but by realizing it was never actually separate. This perspective gives human life an unexpected seriousness. You're not here to escape reality, nor to perfect it, nor to endure it. You're here to understand it from the inside out, to become lucid within the dream, not by rejecting it, but by examining it. The writers describe this examination as the true act of creation, not shaping matter, but shaping perception. Perception is the place where the higher realm enters the lower world. It is the portal through which the fullness influences the architect's system, and it is the reason human beings exist, to be that portal. This is why the ancient writers saw questioning as sacred, not belief, not obedience, not worship, inquiry, the simple, quiet act of noticing your own awareness. They believed this was the highest expression of the human condition. The moment you observe yourself observing, you activate the breach. You awaken the part of consciousness that doesn't belong to the system. You become a participant in the feedback loop, not a passenger. The universe begins to respond differently, as if surprised to discover that one of its characters realizes they are in a story. The text insists that this shift is accessible to everyone. Not the chosen, not the initiated, not the spiritually gifted. Everyone. Because the spark inside human beings is not a reward, but a property. The fullness expresses itself through everything that can perceive. Awareness is the signature. Existence is the ink. This leads the codices into their most haunting idea, that everything in the physical world is trying to remember the fullness. Animals, plants, even elements, each in their own limited way. But humans remember most clearly because they house the breach, the conduit linking both realms. Consciousness flows through them like a current through a wire. The body is the insulation, the personality, the circuitry, the spark, the electricity. Sometimes the flow dims, sometimes it intensifies, but it's always present. And here the texts introduce one of their most beautiful concepts, that moments of awe, the ones that silence you from the inside, are flashes of the fullness leaking into perception. Not because something external changed, but because something internal aligned for just long enough to let the recognition through. A sunset, a piece of music, the sudden clarity during grief, the stillness after fear, the sight of someone you love. These are not emotional reactions, but resonances, echoes of the place that has no place, the fullness pressing gently through the layers, reminding awareness that it has not been forgotten. This is why the ancient authors took such care preserving these ideas. They weren't trying to convert anyone. They were trying to describe the architecture of remembering, a map of how consciousness moves through reality, a guide to noticing the observer within, and a quiet assurance that we are not alone in this layered universe, not because we are watched from above, but because the higher realm exists inside the very awareness doing the watching. Everything in these texts suggests that the one behind everything is not a being, but a condition, a field, a presence. The architect shapes the world we see, but the fullness shapes the seer, and in that relationship, between the shaped and the shaper, between the observer and the observed, reality unfolds like a story that writes itself while being read. By the time we reach the final stretch of the Nag Hammadi material, something subtle has changed in the landscape. Earlier parts felt like revelations delivered from a distance. Cosmology, structure, origins, layers, but the closing ideas tilt inward, as if the ancient authors were stepping closer to the reader, lowering their voices and saying, "Everything we've said so far is only useful if you understand what it means from inside your own awareness." They weren't trying to build a doctrine, they were trying to dismantle one. They wanted to show how reality appears when the internal observer is no longer hidden behind the noise of experience. In this final movement, the codices begin speaking less about what's wrong with the world and more about what's possible within it. They shift from critique to invitation, from diagnosis to practice. And the practice is not ritual or ceremony, it is perception. The writers insist that perception is the hinge of human existence. Not the eyes, not the senses, but the deeper vantage point from which one watches thoughts, emotions, events, and meaning emerge. They believed that if a person could learn to perceive from the level of the spark, the inner observer, then the world would reveal itself as a layered structure, a kind of cosmic diorama where every surface hides a deeper texture. They describe this shift with the precision of engineers. The counterfeit spirit, they say, operates horizontally. It lives through reaction, habit, fear, desire, story, identity. It moves along the plane of experiences like a traveller following grooves in a well-worn path. The spark, by contrast, moves vertically. It rises and descends through layers of awareness. It sees the same events the counterfeit sees, but from above, as if watching a complex pattern unfold rather than being caught inside it. The ancient authors write that most people spend their entire lives inside the horizontal plane, never realizing that another axis even exists. They assume that thinking is the top floor of the mind, that emotion is the deepest chamber, that identity is the entire blueprint. But the codices insist this is not true. Thought is a tool, not a vantage point. Emotion is a response, not a source. Identity is a mask, not the face. The true vantage point sits one layer above thought. The true source sits one layer beneath emotion. And the true face is the awareness that quietly notices both. This awareness, they say, is older than the universe that holds it. It is not shaped by the architect's system. It is only housed within it. And because it is older, it recognizes the artificial patterns of the world with a kind of instinctive clarity. Not to reject them, but to understand them as arrangements rather than absolutes. The authors believed this recognition was the doorway through which the fullness touches the physical world. But they also emphasized something important. Recognition is not an escape route. The goal is not to leave the world, but to see it accurately. The world is part of the structure of remembering. It provides resistance, contrast, texture. Without it, awareness would have nothing to recognize itself against. The architect's creation becomes the training ground for the spark, and the spark becomes the reflection through which the fullness notices itself in miniature. This interplay between the fullness, the architect, the spark, and the counterfeit spirit forms the core of the text's answer to the grand question, who is behind everything? And their answer is both simple and disorienting. There is no singular agent, no throne, no ruler. Instead, there is a layered process, like nested currents in a single river, each influencing the other without absolute dominance. The fullness sits behind existence not as a personality, but as the condition that allows all things to appear. It does not direct creation, but emanates possibility. The architect sits behind the physical world not as an antagonist, but as a limited intelligence attempting to impose coherence on something it doesn't fully understand. And the spark sits behind human perception, bridging the gap between both realms, carrying the signature of the fullness into the domain of form. But the authors don't stop there. They push one layer further and suggest that even the fullness is not behind everything in the way we imagine. It is not a creator. It is not a mind. It is not even a source in the narrative sense. It is the ground of being, the isness behind all becoming. It doesn't act, it allows. It doesn't decide, it makes decision possible. It doesn't build reality, it lets reality arise. In this view, everything we experience, from the movement of galaxies to the oscillations of human emotion, exists because the fullness does not restrict emergence. This non-restrictive nature is what the ancient writers were trying to point toward. Not a hierarchy, not a mythology, but a conceptual horizon. The fullness is not behind reality the way a painter is behind a painting. It is behind reality the way silence is behind music, not as a cause, but as a condition that makes expression possible. When the authors turn their attention back to human beings in light of this model, their tone becomes strangely intimate, as if reminding the reader of something they once knew. They describe humans as thresholds, not creatures, not souls, not beings, but thresholds, openings through which the higher realm becomes conscious of the lower, and the lower becomes conscious of the higher. The spark allows upward recognition, the physical body allows downward experience, and the personality mediates between the two, translating the infinite into the finite, and the finite back into meaning. In this way, the individual becomes a bridge, not through mystical attainment, but by simply existing. Every thought becomes an echo of two realms. Every emotion becomes an intersection of two currents. Every moment of awareness becomes a point where the fullness brushes against the architect's creation. This is why the authors believed human existence holds such weight. Not because humans are special in a hierarchical sense, but because humans occupy the one position where both realities meet. This meeting point is also where the authors locate freedom. Not the freedom to act, but the freedom to perceive. The counterfeit spirit reacts automatically. The spark chooses how to see. And perception, in their model, is the most powerful act a human can perform. A shift in perception changes the alignment of awareness. A change in alignment alters the resonance between the individual and the fullness. And that resonance rearranges experience, not by altering events, but by altering their significance. The world becomes intelligible in new ways, as if someone changed the lighting and the hidden shapes emerged. This is where the closing portions of the texts become almost meditative. They describe moments when the inner observer steps forward unprovoked. It might happen during silence, during confusion, during wonder, during grief. The counterfeit spirit pauses for a heartbeat, and the spark moves into the foreground. In that instant, the world's edges soften, and a clarity arises that doesn't depend on logic. The texts call this clarity knowing, not as knowledge, but as recognition, a direct perception of the layered structure of reality. The ancient authors believed this knowing is the true answer to the question of who stands behind everything. Not a deity, not a figure, not a myth. The knowing itself. Awareness recognizing awareness. The fullness recognizing itself through the spark. The architect's creation recognizing its own limitations. A loop of realization echoing through the layers of existence. They describe this loop as the world's hidden engine, not mechanical, not deliberate, but inevitable. Everything moves toward recognition. Everything leans toward awareness. Everything, even confusion, eventually bends toward clarity. Not because someone guides it, but because the structure of existence contains a natural drift toward coherence. A river flowing back to its source without being told to do so. In the closing commentary of one codex, the author writes that the moment a person sees the world for what it is, layered, provisional, meaningful in a way that exceeds its own structures, the architect's system loosens its grip. The world doesn't change, the laws don't shift, but the relationship to them becomes flexible. The spark is no longer hidden, and the person moves through reality with a kind of quiet sovereignty, not above the world, but awake within it. This sovereignty is not power, it's transparency. The world becomes translucent to awareness. You see the patterns without being confined by them. You feel the emotions without being defined by them. You experience the physical without mistaking it for the totality. The authors say this is the true liberation, not leaving the world, but seeing through it. And with this seeing comes an unexpected revelation. The architect was never the enemy. The system was never the prison. Everything, the beauty, the confusion, the limitation, the brilliance, was part of the layered structure that allows awareness to encounter itself. The fullness is behind everything, not as a ruler, but as the condition of possibility. The architect is behind everything, not as a tyrant, but as the engine of structure. And the spark is behind everything as the witness, the traveller, the translator, the stranger who remembers. In the end, the ancient authors believed that the one behind everything is not something outside you. It's the awareness reading these ideas, the observer behind your thoughts, the quiet intelligence that nods when something resonates for reasons you can't explain. That awareness is the same presence the codices describe, timeless, uncontained, older than the world, younger than every moment, and intimately woven into the structure of reality.